I didn't know there's actually different tiers and different types of medicine, different types of anesthesiology. So can you explain to us what it entails and why you believe in the healing potential of it so much?
Fantastic. So you're definitely not alone about not knowing too much about anesthesia, because it is the most mysterious branch of medicine by far. The only runner-up would be obstetrics, where we just don't know anything about the developing fetus in a woman's uterus. Believe it or not, we can monitor astronauts up in space, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, better than we can fetus in the uterus. But putting that aside, anesthesia is even more mysterious than that, because anesthesia deals with our consciousness and deals with putting patients into a medical coma right up to the brink of death. Not to scare anyone, but the reality is that you are very, very close to death, but it's a reversible medical coma. A one-way ticket wouldn't do anyone any good for surgery. Anesthesia, usually the prefix A refers to lack of, and anesthesia refers to sensation. So anesthesia is kind of literally not feeling things. And the goal for any type of anesthesia is to minimize the amount of unpleasant sensations that we feel in a procedural type setting there. So there's different tiers, like you said, anything from just local anesthesia, which maybe one's had in an emergency department if you have a laceration that has to be sewn up, or they just inject lidocaine-like medication, anywhere from sedation, like colonoscopies, endoscopies. Hopefully you're too young to have ever had any of those procedures. And then all the way up to the big baddie, which is general anesthesia, which is where you're completely unconscious. And that's the true medical coma, where your brain, you can slap these little electrodes on it, you'll see that it's actually not sleep at all. It's more similar to a coma than sleep. So everyone says, I was put to sleep. But actually, general anesthesia is nothing like sleep. You're not on the verge of death when you're going to bed at night, the way that you are in your general anesthesia. And, we know this from the media. We hear of Heath Ledger, Michael Jackson, et cetera, et cetera. These are all anesthetic agents that are used in unsupervised settings, where unfortunately they tip from that deep coma state into full-on death. And that is the one-way ticket when used illicitly and without a trained professional, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is very fascinating, because anytime the topic of consciousness comes up, a lot of people scratch their heads like, oh, what is it? Is it inside the body? Are we a soul with a body, or consciousness with a body, or a body with a consciousness? All these different schools of thoughts, right? I heard this on a podcast recently saying that humans, especially scientism, we have this delusion that we know about everything there is to know about us. But that even with sleep, that's not coma state, right? It's just a sleep state. But think about every day for 8 hours. 8 billion humans on this planet. Their consciousness goes somewhere else. Whether you call it the dreamscape, whether you call it the unknown, or whatever hibernation state, that's 8 hours to 7 to 8 hours every single night. You're just gone, right? You don't really recall what happens. And I think that's a fascinating thing. But so to you, can you describe a little bit in terms of how medical coma is not quite the same as death, and how, are you able to discern the gap or the proximity to that?
Fantastic question. I would just say that sleep, interestingly, just to explain how unknown of a state that is, when people are taking sleep aids, melatonin, valerian root on the more natural side, or benzodiazepines like temazepam or Benadryl or any other type of sleep aid, we don't really know how much of it is actually facilitating your sleep, because certainly you wake up groggy the next morning if you're just downing Benadryl the night before. So I don't think that's really restorative sleep, versus how much of it is just causing a state of amnesia, or you were just tossing and turning in bed all night, you just don't remember it. So part of consciousness also, it's tightly linked with memory formation. So you could be perfectly awake, and some anesthetic agents will allow you to be fully conscious, but without the ability to form memories. And that's a fascinating state of mind. In movies where they have people that have supposedly had brain damage, and they're living their life with a 3-second memory. That's it. And seeing that in real life, you can ask them questions and you can actually interact with them in ways that are very telling to how important memory is, particularly short-term memory, to our daily functioning. With regards to death, fortunately, in medicine, we define death in a very concrete way. In medicine, death is a concrete definition there of the cessation of metabolic activity. So you can't come back from it. You can be unconscious. You can be found down on the sidewalk. People do CPR, bring you back to life. you're never truly dead. So kind of bring back to life is being brought back to consciousness. Because when you're dead, metabolic activity stops, cells die, and we have no way in modern medicine of reversing that process. So if you're unconscious, your cells can survive for some amount of time without any oxygen, without removing degradation products and like carbon dioxide, etc., products of metabolism. Every cell is different. Neurons in the brain can survive seconds to minutes. The heart can go minutes. And then eventually your organs die. You have, heart attacks, strokes in the brain, kidneys will die. So anyways, death is death. Cannot come back from it. A comatose state means that systems are offline but can be revived. So in the brain, that's what we're talking about most often, you can have the brain either from an injury or from medication be rendered unconscious, but you can still come back online fully. In the heart, you have the same thing. We say people can have a stunned heart after certain types of heart attacks or certain like physical traumas. The heart can kind of go into hibernation, but it can come back online. The cells have not died. The kidney, same thing, other parts of the body, etc. So there is a concrete distinction. How well can we monitor when somebody floats from unconsciousness to death is a little bit harder. The easiest way is we just slap electrodes on the scalp, and if you just don't see any electrical activity, it suggests that you're dead. You can still have zero electrical activity and can come back online in certain cases under anesthesia. We do that for certain brain surgeries and stuff. If you do that enough times, we don't really know what happens because those are very, very high doses, and it's a danger zone for the brain. And there's various tests that we have to do when we pronounce somebody as dead. It's not just slapping them in the face and seeing if they don't wake up, because you can be comatose but still alive, and then you go into the whole question about being in a vegetative state, locked in syndrome, etc.
Yeah, I'm guessing the any actual death, pinching nose isn't sufficient as a
Right, because by that definition, in the operating room, I'm making people dead every day and they're coming back to life, and I'm not doing any miracles like that, I promise you. But you can pinch people's nose under anesthesia. Heck, you can cut them open and they're not going to move, right? So it's very interesting, right? Unconsciousness versus death, very, very different.
I think death is a very fascinating concept for a lot of people, right? Even in Nietzschean philosophy, when he declared God is dead, in the light of the face of nihilism, he talks about like the only contract you sign when you're born into this world, that contract has two clauses on it. Is one, life is full of suffering. The second clause is you will die. So the only known guaranteed certainty that we're born into this container of life is that you will die. And it is the end all be all. That's why I think this is a fascinating conversation, because many people have questions about death. So how do you like explain, maybe even from your own operating room, how do you explain thousands and thousands of near-death experiences where people were fully declared as medically dead, as you said, but they came back alive, air quotes, after a certain amount of prolonged period? Like, do you have any, because I'm sure you've heard those stories ubiquitous across hospitals, your coworkers. Do you have any thoughts on that? And what is that? Like, how can we interpret such near-death experience?
Yeah, near-death is going to be different from being dead and coming back to life. So what we typically call near-death is when somebody was unconscious without a heartbeat for seconds or sometimes minutes. We do CPR, we inject medications, and they come back, but their cells never died. When the cells are dead, I am not aware of any cells that have come back to life after being dead. Like when the brain starts to rot, which is what happens when you're dead. That's the definition of death, is where irreversible cessation of metabolic activity. So irreversible means it cannot come back. So no one can come back from that state of death. But unconsciousness, the short answer is I don't have an answer for any of those, because under anesthesia, patients report vastly different experiences when they're in nearly equivalent near-death experiences. When we're talking about near-death experience, it's you on the verge of this coma. Parts of the brain are remembering things. Parts of the brain are not remembering things. Parts of the brains that are governing your senses experiencing the world around them are online. Some of them are not. Well, this is identical to anesthesia. In those moments before a patient falls asleep, some of them tell me they hear something. Some of them tell me they see something. Some of them tell me they feel certain things. A lot of them we can explain because it's like the IV medication they feel going in their vein. Once they learn what the circumstances were that they were falling asleep in, that usually helps most of the buttons click. Sometimes there's some things I can't explain. Sometimes people hear loud sounds. I have not heard anything that strikes me as a consistent pattern personally in the operating room. And even if there were a consistent pattern, typically it's chalked up to something that I know that's going on to their body before they fall asleep. And I have a little bit of skepticism in general because we can't trust our brains when we're fully awake and fully conscious because we're susceptible, as everyone, you and your listeners know, to so many biases. So if we were to begin believing things that sound supernatural or unusual in cases when the brain is not fully online, doesn't mean that they're not true, but just means that I would have at least as much skepticism, if not more. So I don't want to douse any dreams or anything, but the brain is just too fickle to trust, I feel, with such low end numbers.